thank you very much for that kind introduction, Marina. And I'm really very happy to be here with you today. I'm from the Open University in Milton Keynes, the Institute of Educational Technology, and have been there for a long time now, and always continue to be inspired by the mission of the Open University to be open and to provide access to populations of learners who would perhaps not have attended university or studied in any way. So I want to talk today about personal learning on a massive scale, which is a kind of contradiction in terms. Because to be personal, you have to attend to the individual and their particular needs, their requirements, their preferences. But how can we do that on a massive scale? That is going to be a challenge, but something that we need to embrace in the coming years, and something that certainly my university is already very attentive to, and exploring this whole space of how to be more personal in the next few years. We have been, as I say, working in open education for a very long time, but there's always something new coming up and some new thinking around how to extend the reach of our offerings, and now in a more personalized way. So I thought just at the beginning I would mention a brand new Open University module that will be launched very shortly, called Making Your Learning Count. And what this is going to do is it's going to enable people to count the informal learning that they've been doing on something like the Open Learn platform, which has open educational resources. So either using the resources that are on that platform or other open educational resources, the students will be able to pick and choose from the learning they've done and that they want to do, and make up their own learning experience. So it's advertised as being an entirely personal experience, but with the help of a tutor. So the tutor will help the students succeed, hopefully, by identifying what it is that they personally wish to achieve through the module, and their future study plans, so and maybe their employment plans. So it's very much taking an approach that that tries to bridge informal and formal learning, and takes the learner's interests, particular needs, and so on as a starting point. So this is a short module, and we'll see how many people sign up and how it takes off. But it gives you a flavor of our thinking. In fact, yesterday there was a big event at the Open University based on personalization and exploring the various facets of what that term means. And it means many different things to different people. I've done some work in this area, but really before we come to that, I wanted to reflect just briefly on the broader context. In that today we face very significant challenges with education across the world. And I think some of the statistics that we can read are very stark and kind of very challenging, really, to think that today there are still tens of millions of primary age children who are not in school across the world, and that hundreds of millions of adults are illiterate. That's an amazing thing to think that's still the case. And of course, a lot of people across the world still can't access university education. It's in future is going to be very difficult to satisfy the needs of so many people across the globe. In addition to that, I think there's a growing awareness that people have individual needs. Now, this on the slide, I've quoted the statistic which says that almost 1 in 5 people in the UK have a disability. Of course, that's right across the age groups. So perhaps among the younger generation, the percentage is not as high. Nevertheless, I think it's something to bear in mind. And certainly at my university, the numbers of students who are declaring a disability is growing. But thinking beyond that, what we are becoming more aware of, I think, as well, is that many people have impairments that are not necessarily declared or that they're not even aware of themselves, that present a challenge to them in their studies. So one of the things that I've been interested in is how approaches through mobile learning, in particular, can address this whole issue of how we meet people's individual needs, sometimes in a private way. So that's an interesting challenge for us all. And I've been working in language learning for a long time, so the rest of my talk has a focus on language learning. In a world where that learning is changing very rapidly with the advent of many social platforms, online platforms, where learners can come together and learn and practice a whole lot of different languages. And similarly with mobile apps, there are now there's an enormous choice basically of apps that you can use to support language learning in some way. Now many of these platforms and these applications are aimed at beginners or people who have a very specific aim to quickly learn some aspect of language or improve their vocabulary and so on. And some of these are pre-prepared materials, whereas others give learners or teachers indeed the scope to adapt what's there or include it in their practice. So you could have a formal course and alongside it, some kind of informal social activity that extends out into the various platforms that are available on the internet and that people are already using on a massive scale. So there is some research going on in this area as to why people are taking up these opportunities, these informal learning opportunities, what they get out of it, what they don't get out of it, or why it's challenging in the long term. And I hope that more research of this kind will be done, as it is certainly very sort of rich territory to explore. So this is the broad context, and within that, what we need to think about is how people are supported in these environments. So to an extent, they support one another. They form groups, communities, pairs of learners working together. But at various points, they will still need some guidance and some tutoring or some support and so on. So these are things that need to be explored, which really makes us consider the idea of a personal tutor and the kind of assistance or help or teaching that they bring to the situation. And I like this picture on the left-hand side, which is a depiction from the 17th century of a young aristocratic girl with her personal tutor, who in this picture is the goddess Minerva, goddess of arts and sciences, all-knowing, and she is in fact the older sister of the younger girl. And you can see the two cherubs bringing some books for them to consult as part of this tutoring arrangement. So we have moved from a situation which actually still exists today. Personal tutoring is alive and well, as we know, and those who can afford it avail themselves of these opportunities. For those who cannot afford it, it's more difficult, but on the other hand, there are also lots of volunteers out there willing to help you. And of course, there are many now many sort of apps that will and other technologies that will help you, will assist you with your questions and try and help you with your study. So that's the direction we're moving in. I think with these the personal assistants that are already available on smartphones and other gadgets that are coming on stream that will eventually be incorporated, I think, into learning scenarios. And we have to ask ourselves, in what ways can they help? Teachers will worry that these devices will replace them in some way, and we all need to understand what is their specific role, because they will have a role, and they need to be well understood. Already on the horizon are a number of gadgets and technologies being developed that are not yet on the market but are being thought about, are being planned, and people are getting excited about them. Things like in-ear translation gadgets, like this one that from Waverley Labs, that will supposedly help you with your communication, in that they will whisper translations into your ear. And something I came across recently, a concept called Mersive. It's a little camera that you wear, and as you walk around, the camera, and you can see that in the picture below, sees what the objects that you are facing, and it recognizes those objects and potentially generates some instructional materials, or finds some appropriate instructional materials pertaining to those objects, and you can perhaps learn or practice there and then. So that's the idea. Actually not new, because that has been something that's been thought about by researchers for a long time now, and some experiments have been done. Early work on this was done in Japan. But I think it's coming into the mainstream, and it's coming into the realm of this kind of beautiful design, so things you can wear, lovely wearables that are attractive as well as being potentially useful. Of course, they bring with them all kinds of ethical issues around their use, as well as challenges for teachers and learners to understand their place in the whole ecology of resources and technologies that support learners nowadays. But that's a little bit into the future. What we have today and what we have been looking at over the past decade or so has been existing learner practices with their mobile phones, their smartphones. That's the reality nowadays. And what we've been doing in our research at the Open University and with partners around the world is trying to understand learners based on their practices. What are they already doing with their smartphones and mobile phones to try and support their learning, or to solve problems, everyday learning problems, everyday conversational challenges. So this is the realm of self-initiated or self-directed learning practices, in that very often the motivation to start is just having a device and having some apps that are already there or that someone has recommended. And it evolves from there. People will get new ideas from friends, from situations that they face, and think, how can my phone help me in this situation? So these practices, the more we understand about them, the more they can inform the development of new applications to support people. And our work has been in relation to migrant learners in recent years. Why? Well, it's because these people in particular need to learn fast. They need to learn together with others in communities, with groups of friends. And they have phones that they can use, perhaps not top-end phones, but nevertheless they have these kinds of resources, and they are very receptive to the idea of this kind of informal learning, in addition to any formal learning that they engage in, the classes that they go to that sometimes are scheduled at inconvenient times or too far away, too expensive to get to, and so on. So it's very important for new arrivals to extend their learning possibilities. And that's what mobile learning offers. It offers that extension, and it offers a lot of resources that are targeted and tailored to particular situational needs. But what about the teachers in all this? We've been focusing on learners, their practices, and so on. But of course, teachers are very keen to understand these practices and to understand how they should respond. So we had a British Council funded project in 2013 to 14, which was focusing on this area of learning beyond the classroom or outside the classroom, inspired by the learner's own practices. And what we did here was to interview learners and teachers in Brighton about their practices, what they had adopted in the way of learning through smartphones, and what potential they could see, what were their existing practices that could be built into the learning environment. So we produced a guide which explains the whole pedagogical approach to the teachers, gets them to rethink their practice, helps them with app selection. There are many generic apps that can be adapted, so that's the emphasis. What are the generic apps, not just the ones that are already pre-packaged? And how do we go about designing mobile learning activities for these new scenarios? And the picture there on the left illustrates the classroom in the middle, and then all the activity that goes on outside the classroom and how that might enter the classroom space in a virtual sense. So via the different kinds of social networks and mobile apps, how experiences of learners outside the classroom or others that they know can become incorporated in the classroom, and also how the teacher can plan for learning that will take place outside of class. So in this instance, these were students who were learning English in Brighton. So they had come over to the UK and they were learning English. But they wanted to make use of their environment for learning. They wanted to go out into the streets and both take advantage of their environment and also prepare for class, like making notes and so on. So we have tested this guide on many occasions with teachers, got a lot of feedback, and part of the guide was had a focus on this framework that we developed, which has the design of an activity at its center. So how does the activity exploit various aspects? And what we're doing here is inviting teachers to think about these different aspects. You can find more detail in the guide, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this here today, but we also help teachers to translate this into a kind of lesson plan. So it can seem very, very conceptual, but there is also a practical way to move forward with such a representation. But in terms of the actual framework, the important things to recognize here are teacher wisdom, so the role of the teacher as being central to this activity, because whatever we have discovered about learner practices has always come back to the idea that they do need at some point to consult a teacher. So the teacher's experience and their designs are very important. The device features focuses not just on the features of the device itself, but the kind of learning it enables. Multimodal, seamless learning, more authentic, more collaborative. Then we talk also about learner mobilities, which goes far beyond just thinking about the movements of the learner, to think also about the way that they use time to learn, dividing up their day into short periods of time, taking advantage of short periods of time to fit in some practice or some learning, and also thinking about it even more broadly in terms of the contexts that they move between and the cultures they move between and their particular personal goals. And finally, language dynamics is a key aspect. So I'm talking about the 4 elements in the middle, and the language dynamics aspect relates to the fact that communication channels are always springing up. New ways of sharing content, sharing, exchanging comments, and so on. As we know, every day there's some new facility, WhatsApp, Instagram, and so on that comes up, and people start to use it. And language itself, as we know, is also constantly evolving. So that aspect should be incorporated into the activity. The choice of channel and the emphasis on investigating how language is changing. Some of that change, of course, being instigated by the use of new technologies and needing to talk about them and to understand them. And then on the outside, we have pedagogical aspects such as reflection on learning, rehearsal, learner-driven inquiry, and reconsidering the outcomes, because if we really embrace this way of thinking, then the outcomes might go beyond language proficiency to other outcomes that are connected with mobile literacies, for instance. So it needs to be thought about more broadly. So we have a framework. I think this could be embraced in its totality, and you could think, right, I'm going to completely change my practice as a teacher. On the other hand, you could just adopt it in a small way. You could say, well, I'll try this out for one activity and see how it goes. So hopefully it's not a very threatening approach. And we've continued to work on the idea of supporting teachers and really trying to help them understand what it means to personalize the learning experience for their learners. So more recently, last year, I was commissioned by Cambridge University Press to develop this report, so a research-based report, but oriented towards teachers and policymakers, to explain in relatively simple terms, or kind of, you didn't have to have a background in educational technology to understand. This concept of personalization from a teacher's point of view, and to give examples of how it has been realized in mobile through the use of mobile technologies to date. So this teaching approach in general takes account of learner differences and preferences. That's key to it, actually. And then the other aspect to consider is that we're trying to support people in the realization of their goals. Now, these don't have to be individual goals, personalization sometimes is taken to mean how it should be tailored to the individual, but I increasingly think that groups are very important. So small groups, perhaps of people who have common needs and aims. So these can be predetermined goals, either predetermined by an existing curriculum or setting, or negotiated goals, meaning that the learner puts forward their aspirations or needs, and the teacher has some goals, and there's a process of negotiation where they come to an understanding of how both parties can be more satisfied with the learning that will take place. So that's kind of the basis for it, and you can download this report and see all the examples in it. I'm just going to mention a couple of examples by way of illustration. So for example, we talk in this report about the ANT audio news trainer app, which I was involved in its development with some colleagues at in Spain at UNED. So this is the Spanish distance learning university, because they had identified with their students a need to support those who needed to improve their English as they were starting out on or hoping to undertake university study. And they wanted to be able to develop their listening comprehension. They were already listening to news, so that was part of their existing practices, but they wanted some more support with this activity. So we designed something really very simple, but it was well received, in that the learners have a choice of levels, so green, yellow and red indicate the different levels of difficulty of listening. And this repertoire of news changes all the time, so there's always something new to listen to. And it's linked to a Facebook page where the learners discuss what they've been hearing or just summarize it. So a very simple idea, but I think what this illustrates is that connection with what the learners wanted to a very simple design that supports ongoing practice in listening comprehension. So that's one example. Another one being something that has been developed as part of PhD research in Canada. Carrie Demens-Epp developed this app which recognizes that learners will always want new content and new resources. So based on their demands, so it's an on-demand system, the app looks for internet-based resources that can be added to the content that's already there. So it's a constant process of, again, refreshing the content, linking to what the learners actually want. And the approach is that this is a way of supplementing the language learning with this kind of adaptive mobile application. In our own work, as I mentioned briefly, we have been engaged with migrant learners across Europe. So I'll say a little bit about the Mazeltov project, which was a major project lasting several years with partners in various European countries. And we developed this prototype app, which you can see at the center of the screen. Effectively, it's a collection of different services and tools. So developed with collaboration from the potential learners, so through workshop activities to determine what kind of resources and tools they wanted, but also suggesting new things that they might not have thought of. So augmented reality navigation was introduced there, and a help radar, which was the ability to summon volunteers who are nearby, who can help you sort out a difficulty that you're facing. So these are things that perhaps learners may not have encountered before and wouldn't have thought to suggest. So I think a collaboration between the identification of needs from the learner's side, their existing practices, and those will vary from very basic to sophisticated, and then and their interests, like playing games. And at the center of it really is language learning, because they all wanted that, and they all wanted to be able to practice and learn regularly. Underpinning this set of tools and resources is a recommendation engine as well. So in that sense, everything is integrated. It's not just a collection of tools and resources, it is an integrated collection. And the way it works is that the learner specifies their interests, and also the app can track their movements. And using that information, recommendations can be made as to where they might want to go in the city or what kinds of resources they might want to access. It also tracks some aspects of their progress in their language learning, and also in what resources and apps they have used, so that they can reflect on that. The point about this whole thing is that it empowers learners to start thinking about what apps and resources they need and how they will use them as they make their way around the city. For the learners that we worked with, this was a very new idea. They had phones, they used them to communicate with friends, but really many of them hadn't gone beyond that. So it was putting quite a sophisticated tool in their hands, but they did react to it very well. They were very interested in this idea that the language learning was integrated with everyday activity, and integrated with their movements around the city, and perhaps encouraging them to go to places they wouldn't have gone otherwise, which I think was also an important aspect, although we didn't set out to do that. So the idea was language learning for social inclusion. These were the main services in the prototype app. As I said, they could summon local help. So volunteers would declare their availability. The social network, as you might expect, was very well used. People discussed their challenges and suggestions there, either in English or in their first language. So it was a mix of languages that were being used there. I should say that this app actually was produced in several language pairs, depending on where the migrant learners were located. So in the UK it was Spanish speakers we were particularly working with. So in the forum there would be a mix of English and Spanish, as people tried things out a little bit in English or turned to Spanish when they felt more comfortable with that. There were some information resources, a translation app, which at the time it was developed was a very new thing. Now these things have become more available in terms of being able to take a photograph of text and get that translated. Navigation guides, a game, and language learning. So these were the main resources, I said, underpinned by the recommender system. So we learned quite a lot from this project, in that the concept was seen to work, was well received. I think that with the kind of project that this was, a lot of the effort went into the development, the technical development, and although people tried these things out over a number of weeks, they didn't have that opportunity to engage with these tools over a much longer period, which would have been the ideal situation. So to have a full integration of this kind of activity with formal learning as well over a period of time. So that's not something that was possible within this project, but that would be interesting to see whether over time the idea of people determining their own goals, setting their own goals and following through would be sustainable. The other thing that we learned is that that learners do prefer to learn at home. So even though they are encouraged to go out and use the app as they were walking around or traveling around town, many of them were happy to do that a little bit, but then they felt comfortable and that they had more time when they were back home to continue their learning. So after Mazeltov, we've gone on to do other projects. If there's time at the end and you have further questions about this one, I can come back to it. But I wanted to move on to tell you very briefly about another interesting, much smaller project called SALSA that we then conducted on the back of Mazeltov, in a sense. So using the experience we'd gained and some funding from the local Milton Keynes Smart City initiative. We wanted to see how the idea of location-based learning could be explored in Milton Keynes, working with English language learners from the local Adult Continuing Education Centre. And we thought we would have 27 locations in Milton Keynes and build some dialogue-based scenarios for each one, not necessarily unique to that location, because there could be similar types of location. And that there would be beacons in these locations, and as the learner comes across the beacon, the content is triggered on their phone. So potentially, they could look at that content anytime. But what was interesting was this idea of you go to a place and content is triggered, and you learn there and then or later, as you choose. But it kind of potentially motivates you to keep on learning, to keep visiting different places and keep learning. So with each of these scenarios, there would be a dialogue with a transcript, which was specifically developed for these locations with a partner that we've been working with for a long time. And there would be vocabulary and grammar, and particularly an emphasis on idioms and phrases that were useful, and recommendations for further activities or practice in that location. So potentially people you could speak to or things you could try out. And also an emphasis on pronunciation of things like place names, which isn't on that list, but it was actually important as well. And there was also a beacon on the bus, so on these Arriva buses that run in some parts of Milton Keynes. So they agreed to us having a beacon on the bus. So people could practice some expressions that are relevant to being on the bus. And that was also and this was a bus that many of the learners used to travel to their education centre. So that was why it was selected. So that was an interesting experience, which included collaborative design with the learners. They were given a map of Milton Keynes. They were asked to annotate locations where they had encountered language challenges. Then these ideas were used to draw up a list of sites where these activities would be triggered. The participants very much wanted to learn what the local would say in this situation. The tutor's perspective was more about how they could be supported to pass their citizenship tests. So it was a collaborative effort trying to reflect the needs of both parties, both perspectives. And then in the actual trial, the participants used a paper-based diary to record which locations they'd visited and what they had done there. And as I mentioned in the previous project, so similar here, although the learning was triggered in town, some people undertook it there and then, but really a lot of it was done back at home. And recently an article was published by a couple of colleagues reporting in more detail about this project, which you may wish to have a look at. It's available in the Journal of Interactive Media and Education. So, following on from Mazel Tov and Salsa projects, we've done a lot of reflection and planning for new work related to these experiences. We've also been reading more broadly about accounts of the experiences of particular migrants and refugees, which are starting to be published and give us, I think, deeper insights. And in particular, what is coming through is this interesting and important connection between home learning and learning outside the home, whether that be formal or informal. And I think I picked out this one particular reference because it's such a rich account of how of the literacy practices in the home and how they draw on different languages. And the author makes the point that these home practices are often overlooked in adult literacy education. That the families may have vast resources, passion for learning, their multilingual practices, children often helping adults in their home. And that home environment may include the use of different kinds of technologies in media, game playing, translation tools, social media, and that is not so well understood because not so much work has been done inside people's homes to see what's going on. Also, there are remarks about how the classroom provokes anxiety, and that's echoed in many accounts. So how in a formal classroom often the learners feel humiliated, not being able to speak and be understood, and that how that contrasts with their relaxed and more happy, I suppose, home environment in many cases. And in this particular case also, the interesting aspect is that the learners, the woman who is at the center of this account, has a son who is profoundly deaf and therefore has very particular learning needs when it comes to learning English, and that's well understood at home, but not so well understood outside. So I think this illustrates an important approach to understanding existing practices, not just out in the world, but also at home, and how we link the two. And the sorts of personal choices that people therefore make, either at home or externally. And I like this account of what is described as competence in plurality. So the fact that migrants may be very attached to their original language identity and wish to stay with that as their predominant identity. Or they may be in a process of a gradual dropping of the language of origin to take on the target language. Or they may be trying to juggle the two in a kind of giving them equal weight, perhaps. And that is again something that maybe there's not so much consideration given to, certainly in the approaches that we see often described in research accounts. This is work that is done in the context of migrant and refugee learning, not necessarily with technology. I also wanted to highlight this rather interesting toolkit, which apparently is coming this autumn, produced with the aim of supporting adult refugees, a kind of a toolkit for language support. And I think it will be interesting to see what is there, because it incorporates how volunteers working with refugees can offer language support. So people who perhaps don't have a teaching qualification, but they need to be able to support refugees more effectively. And also I think what is interesting to note is work that's going on alongside that on the language of resilience. So this is a British Council funded or produced piece of work which looks at a range of voices, so children and young people, parents, teachers, community workers, NGOs and so on, also considering the particular needs of those with disabilities. And the themes include support for home language learning, bringing refugees and host communities together, and a greater recognition of the psychosocial aspects of language learning with regard to people who've been through traumatic experiences. And I think that is something that we can learn from for all language learning environments. So there will be a lot of I think, cross-fertilization between these different fields of endeavour as we move forward to the next few years, supporting increasing numbers of refugees and migrants and learning from their experiences to take advantage of that for, I think, broader populations of language learners. And finally, a few recommendations for learning design from the various projects that we've conducted and the readings that we've done. There is so much that can be said, so it's hard to pick out a few things. Nevertheless, I would definitely want to emphasize the need to start with learners' experiences and their prior learning practices. And that will be a combination typically of traditional classroom learning with their informal learning with their own personal technologies. And so on that basis, we can consider how to support individual needs. And I would include those needs that the learner does not always wish to reveal to us, but perhaps we can show them ways of using technology that they can explore for themselves to support their needs or with others who have similar requirements. And I think these resources and applications need to be developed collaboratively, learners and teachers, but also all those other people who now support the learner in social media networks, the volunteers, the new incarnations of personal tutors and assistants that will increasingly enter this learning space. And I think we need to consider ways in which those new activities can work in harmony with people's daily lives and their existing practices. We also need to think about situationally useful language, certainly, definitely in relation to the kinds of populations I've been talking about. But also, and this aspect has not been given quite so much thought, is how to deal with the unexpected and the unpredictable. And I think this is going to become more important, how we equip people or help them with that aspect. And finally, last but not least, I suppose, how to support learners in defining their own learning goals. And these own learning goals can be group goals, as I mentioned, and the kind of further engagement in collaborative learning in fulfillment of those goals. So to many learners, certainly ones we've worked with, this is a new idea. They haven't in the past been invited to define their own goals. I think this can be supported not only through technological means, of course, but in some ways also by getting the learner to use the technology to think about their goals and monitor them or pursue them over a longer period of time. And that brings me to the end. So just a reminder of the report on personalization, where you can find further examples